Welcome back to another JJ in the Field. Timely agronomic tips you need them most. I'm Jonah Johnson. So today we finally made it to September 2022. As you can see, we're obviously in a cornfield. And so we've had a lot of calls and concerns from growers that have been out in their corn walking, hopefully looking to kind of put some quantification to what their ear set and kernel set is and try to get some early season yields. And, you know, across Ohio, production this year has been, you know, from the growing season, overall very, very good. Now, do we have some pockets that are not as happy, you know, endured some stress? Absolutely. We can all contest that depending on where you reside here in Ohio. But I just wanted to kind of talk about some of the concerns we've been getting, and most of that's been around kernel set in our cornfields this year. So for growers in pockets of Ohio, they've had very timely rain events, kind of in south central Ohio as an example. They've had timely rains about every week, and everything's kind of in that green garden state. We got ears that are filled to the tip and pericarp set, and we're in that dense stage, and those kernels are filling very successfully and unhindered from really much stress. You get in other parts of Ohio, kind of south, more centralized Columbus, kind of up in that relative radius of the Columbus area, kind of in out from there. They kind of miss some timely rain, so there's actually some areas that are probably more or less considered an unclassified drought right now. So corn plants are senescing, quickly dying, but we're also seeing corn hybrids starting because of the time of year we're getting into. You know, they're reaching, if they were planted early, maturities are drying down. They're just starting to die naturally because that's their maturity range in some of these areas that follow the latitudes across Ohio. And so the concern I wanted to talk about today is where we're in fields and we're seeing extreme deviations in large noses or kernel drawback or tip back. There was multiple names associated with this in fields. And so if you've not been in your fields, you know, and we've seen this over a scope of ranges of fields. So we've been in fields that where we'd expect, you know, they look stressed, plants are fired up at the lower part of the canopy early. You know, obviously some nutrition stress followed those corn plants. Also, some other things we can have to show is nutrient loss within the plant. And so I've been taking a lot of aerial images here over the last couple days, and in these images, what you'll see on the screen here shortly, you'll notice that there's several other things that can cause some stresses out in the fields that you wouldn't have seen from the ground. So I mentioned nutrient stress, plants firing up from the bottom. So what we've seen in these aerial images is that, number one, we've seen where water or the absence of water have caused nutrient loss out in the field inherently based on topography, soil types, textures, what have you. And you'll note in those images, you'll see these erratic yellow spaces out in these cornfields. And so, you know, a lot of times that would make sense. And ears associated in those areas would be, you know, not as fulfilled as if they didn't endure that stress. Other places we've noticed is misapplication of nutrients. And so in the next picture, you'll note that we could see a replicated occurrence across the field, and this was tailored back to the application equipment not making an accurate application of the fertilizer in that field, hence mostly nitrogen, sulfur. So you can see that yellowing that follows that field. So we'd expect you to see different ear variances within those zones, and that makes sense. The next image that you'll see is that we've seen fields that experience premature death. And so when that occurs, you'll note that the brown spots in the field, obviously they died too early for whatever reason. In this specific event, it was in the rolling areas. It endured stress early. We were very wet early. Later on, I flew the pictures, and you could see that the stress followed those plants the remainder of the growing season. So the green areas of the field, you know, those are the longer stay green where they did not prematurely die, and ears associated within the good areas were very good. The ears in the areas that premature died were not as good. Noses and test weight or kernel weights are going to be low there too, because all those had very deep dents in the kernels of those ears. And that can be another thing associated with these noses or any type of stress regarding in these cornfields, is that you'll note as the kernel set, if I have bubbled out kernels or very shallow dents, we're going to have very, very heavy kernel weights. If you get really deep dents in those, we're going to have very light and fluffy test weights from those kernel weights. So we've been in fields that are green to the ground, ear leaf all the way up to the top of the canopy, little to no disease pressure, and we see these large noses. It's not following hybrids, it's not following companies, it's not necessarily following geography either, which is a little bit more perplexing this year. So as to put a bug in your ear as you're walking your field, just to be cognizant so you don't see this when it's getting into the combine header when you're harvesting your corn. And so there's several things going on here, and I have a couple examples But if you note in this field, we have 3 different ears that came from this same field. And note that, if we had nothing but these, we'd be super excited, because this is, I usually can tell when I grab around, this is 18 to 20 around, and I think when we count it was like 45 to 50 long, filled to the tip. But not very far from these plants, you can see variance where we had, even though this ear you would say I'm not really excited about it, it's still 20 around and 40 long. So that's still going to be some really good corn, but not to mention what's going on with these big noses. Then this guy, which was not much further down in the row, you can note that small ear, yellow dimpled kernels where we had nutrition stress, and then like here we had ones that didn't pollinate in general. And so when this happens, there's some multiple issues that's going on in the field or in the environment that can cause this. So one of the things, first of all, is obviously heat stress. If we think about back in July, we had 3 weeks of very high temperatures, high humidity. And if that coupled in a time range when your corn is going through pollination, because you think about that process, water sensitive structures, we have our pollen coming out of our tassel, we have our silks that are almost 100% water, upper structures are about 90% water, and we have high heats coupled with that time frame that can hinder. We get silk balling, where you get a massive amount of silks coming out and you get some shading from those. Sometimes the pollen can't get to those underlying silks and pollinate to those. We can have insect damage that clips those silk, and we've heard of that, especially in west and northwest Ohio, where we've had an abundance of rootworm beetles. That was kind of surprising to see that they were very active. Japanese beetles, the same thing. Also, the big thing that a lot of guys don't consider, if you go back and track those high daytime temperatures, the corresponding nighttime temperatures were very high as well. I remember a lot of times going to bed late in the evening and seeing mid 80s still on the weather stations around Ohio. So those nighttime temperatures, when you have high respiration rates, will be the equivalent of you're running a marathon during the day and you didn't stop to sleep at night and you just kept running. Any energy you consumed, your body wouldn't be benefiting from it. So the same thing in the corn plant. If it's consuming all what it made during the day, it's not going to store any of that in our ears, in the kernels. And so anytime those type of environmental stresses occur, and it sets so many kernels deep or long, then they start to draw back. And everybody, has probably seen that once or at least once in their careers of farming. Some of the other more obscure abnormalities that we can see this in is obviously drought stress. Those pockets I previously mentioned, I'm expecting some of that. We've had plants that pre-cannibalize themselves up pretty high already, and so those are putting some warnings on some fields in those areas to watch those for an early harvest, because they're going to be pretty weak, not have much rigidity left in those stalks and the shanks. And we've told those growers to make sure you target those as an early harvest field. Some other places that guys have reported, okay, so we went through all these different deficiencies, say we had a lot of water early, our nitrogen we applied, we lost a lot of that. So those would correspond to plants that were brown and yellow up from the base up. And when you look at those kernels on the ear, you can see those yellow pimply kernels. So if a ear kernels did not pollinate, those are typically towards the tip, and you'll see places on those ears that you could tell nothing ever initiated or started. Those ovules through the pollen tube never received pollen to physically pollinate them from the beginning. Now, where we get kernel abortion, we call it, is that we get successful pollination, but some stress occurred and that plant said, well, wait a minute, I can't support all that length on those ears. Then they start to draw back, and you kind of get that conical shape on the ear where you see dimpled, yellowed kernels. But later in the season, if you've not been out yet, those start to diminish that color, and it's harder to differentiate. Was it a pollination issue or was it an abortion issue? And so other places that we've seen that in fields that, number one, they were green all year, had little to no disease pressure, and we still are seeing very large nose back. And so one abnormality that I'm making some assumptions on this year is that mycorrhizae fungus. So you might have heard this. This is has been more popular in the last couple years as an amendment you can add on into your planter or sometime during the growing season. I would kind of quantify this and compare it to something similar like Rhizobia bacteria in soybeans. So Rhizobia japonicum, that's a beneficial that, when you add that as a seed treatment, for example, it's a handshake between that bean that it says, if you let me grow on your roots, I'll help provide nodules and nitrogen to the soybean. So mycorrhizae is a fungal infection that occurs that it increases root surface area. So if you think about like my hands and arms or roots of a corn plant, and that mycorrhizae infects, you get all these microscopic roots that penetrate from every surface area of that current in native root system. And so it increases the natural root area dramatically. And so for water interception, specifically phosphorus and nitrogen, it helps with that. So where you've had fields that sat early, we've had ponding, flooding, which in some areas of Ohio that had ample rainfall, but they had received the rain in very high amounts in a very short amount of time, where we've had ponding and flooding, that can actually kill those mycorrhizae fungus and be a detriment to those corn plants the remainder of the season. So when that happens, that's where we can also see some of these nose drawback. The other thing I didn't mention is talking about disease pressure. Disease pressure overall of Ohio this year has been relatively low, and we compare like the new disease tar spot of corn in Ohio. Last year it was a major presence and a very yield limiting disease. This year it's not been as bad, and it's again been predominantly in north central and northeast Ohio, and where guys applied fungicides timely, the fungicides did their job and the corn looks very good. Where guys did not plan on it or did not put a fungicide or didn't think to do so, it's very evident where fields that had tar spot pressure and didn't receive a preventative measure to suppress that disease, it's very aggressive. And so that's not uncommon to see. Drawback on those is there. So obviously an abundance of different hypotheses that we have of why we're seeing noses and ears this year, but we just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of that, so when you're out in your fields and scouting, you can kind of go back and check mark, did I experience a stress during certain parts of the growing season? That I have nitrogen loss, that I have water problems, whether too much or not enough, or did we have some of these other erratic issues like mycorrhizae being killed on the plants and leading to some of these ear abnormalities. Now, another thing that can cause big noses on ears is also, so you go back to how seed vendors will classify hybrids, is it a more fixed hybrid or is it more flex hybrid? And so sometimes we can inherently have ears that have big noses because the old analogy that, well, I must have not planted my populations high enough, right? So when you have a more flex type hybrid that if you give them space in the field plant population wise, they'll normally inherently fill those noses out. So those are other things you can go back and check as well. Did you have a more flex hybrid or did you have a more fixed hybrid that always sets the same amount of kernels long on that ear? So if you have more further questions on that, feel free to reach out to your local ASA or any of us on the PCT team. I'm Jonah Johnson. Thanks for watching.